Hello friends, the Bourbon Nerd here. Welcome to my second lesson in the Bourbon School. I will be covering in this lesson the different types of American whiskey. And before you freak out, I'll just let you know that there are 30 different types, more than 30 different types of whiskey, and I'm obviously not going to cover it in this video, otherwise it'll take like an hour or something. So I have selected like a handful of what I think are the most important ones, and then I have a couple of honorable mentions at the end, but we will get to those when we get towards the end of the video. As always, I'm trying to hydrate myself as much as possible while doing these lessons. So this time I actually gone for a Michter's Barrel Strength Rye, a great product. So I'll be looking forward to that. So if you have something in your glass as well, cheers all. All right, let's get started. So I've selected 5 different types of whiskey that I think are very, very important. Obviously bourbon, which I covered in the last lesson. But I'll also go over, the second most sold whiskey in the United States, which is rye whiskey. I will also be covering corn whiskey, which is sort of the weird cousin in the family, and you'll find out when we get to that. And then wheat whiskey, which is a very special type of whiskey. And then finally here, as you see, I have American single malt in parentheses. And the reason why I put it in those are that they're technically no standard yet for American single malt. My prediction is there'll probably be something later this year, or maybe in 2023. That's what I predict, where American single malt get their own, whiskey type. But for now, I'm covering it as well. And of course, because I've had many of you reach out regarding bourbon versus rye, I'll actually do a little bit of a deep dive comparison between those two types in this video as well. All right, so bourbon, I will not cover it in very many details because we already covered it in the last lesson. So I have the basic stuff on the screen right now, as you can see. We covered that in the previous lesson, and the reason why I put it up anyway is that for the next whiskey types, I will sort of mark in red or strike out if there are any changes compared to the bourbon rules, because as you will see, most of the whiskey types are very, very closely related to bourbon itself, right? So this is bourbon. So we knew that from the last lesson. So if I switch to the next one, which is rye whiskey. And this is number 2 in the United States. I think currently for every 12 bottles of bourbon, they are being sold 1 rye. And it used to be 20 bourbon per 1 rye. So rye is catching a little bit up with bourbon, but probably never will reach bourbon. So there you have sort of like an idea here. So as you can see here, there are just a few changes compared to the bourbon rules. Not surprising, it needs to contain predominantly rye in the mash bill, and I will promise to come back in an upcoming lesson about this whole mash bill thing. So instead of 51% corn or higher in bourbon, it will be 51% rye or higher. And then there's a small thing in the second last bullet, and it is so important thing that I'll actually have a separate lesson where I will cover this. So you may remember from bourbon, you can only add water to bourbon no matter what. So there is actually a little bit distinction here, because if a rye whiskey is not a straight rye whiskey, then you can actually add up to 2.5% of stuff to the rye whiskey. And I know it sounds horrible, and it actually is a little bit, but I will cover that in a lesson called What is Straight Whiskey. So that's a pretty interesting thing right there. And then I struck out, has to be made in the United States, because bourbon, with one other exception, is actually the only American whiskey type that has to be made in the United States. All the other ones, wheat whiskey, corn whiskey, rye whiskey, can be made anywhere in the world. So they're very, very, very close siblings, bourbon and rye. And as you can see here, here I have 2 bottles. They are from the same manufacturer. They look alike, and they also taste a little bit alike. And I've actually put up here, if you think about it, this is actually a true thing. So let's say that one manufacturer had a 51% corn and 49% rye mash bill. That product would be a bourbon. If it would be a 51% rye and 49% corn, it would be a rye whiskey. You would not be able to tell the difference, taste the difference, look at the difference, because they will, in all intents and purposes, be identical, because the differences are so small. Generally, I would say, especially for bourbon, the portion of corn is much, much higher in the 70s and the 80s, but also on the rye whiskeys, there are even rye whiskeys that consist of 100% rye. And generally, bourbon tend to be a little bit on the sweeter side, whereas rye is more on the spicy side, but I'll also cover that a little bit later. All right. Then let's go to the odd one, as I call it, corn whiskey. And it's probably closer to some of the whiskeys that you can imagine that they drank on the prairie in the old Wild West, etc. It's more like, moonshine or corn whiskey, if you will. So there are some very, very significant differences compared to bourbon. First, it has to be minimum 80% corn, not 51% corn in the mash bill. And then the second bullet there is very, very important, and that's what makes it the odd one out here. So if you notice on the sentence here, there are 2 ors in there, which means there are 3 different types of aging that are allowed. Well, firstly, no aging is allowed. So you're actually allowed to sell a corn whiskey that is completely unaged. So it'll be completely transparent and white as water, and you can still call it corn whiskey. You could also age it in used barrels. It could be used bourbon barrels. It doesn't really matter. But you could technically also, this is allowed, store or age a corn whiskey in a new barrel. It just cannot be a charred or burnt on the inside barrel. And I'll cover all that with charring, as I promised, in an upcoming lesson. So there are 3 different ways that you can do this. So you cannot age a corn whiskey in a new charred oak barrel. It has to be either used or not charred, or in principle not aged at all. And the rest there is pretty much the same. Same goes with rye whiskey. You cannot put anything in it unless it's not called straight. Then it's the same with rye whiskey. You can put stuff in it, and I'll come back to the stuff. And then as I said, it doesn't have to be made in the United States. All right. So here's a little bit of scenario. You probably wondered, hang on, I think he said in the first lesson that bourbon could actually be up to 100% corn. And now you're saying corn whiskey can also be, minimum 80, so also up to 100. So what's the difference here? So here I have 2 of my favorite whiskeys. They're both from Balcones in Texas. In fact, I have the bottles right here. And as you can see here, they've taken quite the hit, because here where I live, it's very, very difficult to get them. So these are both made from 100% corn. One is bourbon and one is corn whiskey. And you may think, what on earth is going on? So what do you think the difference is? Yeah, if you paid a little bit attention to what I just said, then of course the difference is the bourbon on the left here is stored in a new barrel. And the one on the right, the corn whiskey, is stored in, or aged rather, in a used barrel. So that is literally the only difference. So, yep, there you have it. All right, moving on. So, wheat whiskey, and I put here in the heading here, still on hiatus. The reason why I put it there is that for all the time I've been involved with whiskey and American whiskey, I haven't really seen any traction on wheat whiskey. There are 7 or 8 products out there. The one on screen here is from Bernheim wheat whiskey, which is owned by Heaven Hill. It's probably the most sold and most known, but there are 7 or 8 different manufacturers. I think even, I do have one here from Dry Fly, a wheat whiskey. So it's not the only one, but it's sort of a little bit rare. And I'm not really sure why it hasn't received any traction. It's very nice whiskeys, but as you can see here, compared to rye whiskey, the rules are identical. The only difference, of course, being that instead of 51% rye, it's 51% wheat or higher, and that is basically the difference here. All right, moving on. So the last one. And remember those parentheses around American single malt, as I said, it's still awaiting approval. And I didn't bother put everything in red here because the rules are completely different from the other whiskeys that I just showed here. There is this American single malt whiskey commission that started a few years ago that almost have us getting close to 200 members now. So there's a lot of people making American single malt. And if you know a little bit about single malt, primarily coming from Scotland, of course, the rules here are very, very much inspired by rules in Scotland. I'll go through them really, really quick here. So it has to be made from 100% malted barley. And don't worry about if you don't know what malted is and malting and why you would do something called malting. I will cover that in a separate lesson. It has to be distilled entirely at one distillery, just like a single malt in Scotland. In fact, single malt in Scotland primarily means that it is distilled at a single distillery. Then, of course, for this one, given it's an American single malt, it also has to be made in the United States. And that's why I said before, everybody think bourbon is the only whiskey type that can only be made in the US. That is correct, but when American single malt become a improved whiskey type, that will be the second one as well. And then a fun little thing, but that's also what they do in Scotland, is it has to be matured, of course, in oak casks, and they cannot exceed 700 liters, which is about 185 gallons. So they are huge barrels, and in comparison, a normal bourbon or rye barrel is typically 200 liters, which is like 53 gallons. So they're quite large there. And then the rest, maximum 160 proof. And then for the distillate and minimum 80 proof going into the bottle. And when we talked about in the first lesson about bourbon, there are no requirements of the proof level going into the barrel itself. So that's a little bit interesting, and I will cover that in a lot of details in another session because that's actually pretty important. All right, so those were the 5 types that I sort of selected. And then, as I promised, some honorable mentions. And I'll tell you why they're honorable mentions is that there's so much to tell about these 2 here that I omitted. And if you're a bourbon nerd or a whiskey geek, you may be thinking, what has he omitted? So I'll tell you in a second. But there's so much to tell about these 2 whiskey types that I'll actually do a separate lesson on each of them. So the first one, of course, is Tennessee whiskey. So you can do the check yourself. Go into Google right now, pause the video, and search, is Jack Daniel's a bourbon? You will get between 6 and 8 million hits. You will find thousands of people basically shouting at each other. Some are claiming, of course it is a bourbon. Other people are claiming, no, it's not a bourbon. And I will have a separate lesson on this because it's a fascinating story. Why or why not Tennessee whiskey is not a bourbon. So a little bit of cliffhanger there. And then the second honorable mention is something called light whiskey. And it's not really because the whiskey in itself is spectacular. It's just all the things around the invention of light whiskey back in the 70s and 80s were mind-boggling. Maybe they even came out in late 60s. I think it's 70s basically. There's so much of American pop culture involved in this that it's unbelievable. So it's a great story. I have a separate lesson and just a cliffhanger here as well. So it's more about the stuff leading up to the invention of light whiskey rather than the whiskey itself, as I mentioned. Light whiskey is not lighter in terms of alcohol or calories, but you will know about that when we get to that lesson. And then for the final thing in this lesson, there are a couple of terms that are sort of indirectly related to the topic of this lesson that I thought that I would share with you. You may have heard about it and you wonder, what exactly does this mean, right? So the first couple ones are something called barely legal rye. So barely legal rye means that the manufacturer have just put in 51% rye in the mash bill, so they're just meeting the requirements. And that is because if they want to have a taste profile that's more on the sweeter side, like corn and bourbon, but they really want to, promote and sell a rye whiskey, then they can get away with just putting 51% rye in it, and it's called barely legal rye. And as you can see here, there's this product also from Heaven Hill called Rittenhouse. That is an example of a barely legal rye. It meets all the requirements, but only just. And then there's another term that you may have heard about that causes a little bit confusion. and that term is high rye bourbon. So you think, so what I mean, does it mean a rye or a bourbon? So what it means is that the percentage of rye in the mash bill of the bourbon is high. So, I mean, high meaning in principle up to 49, because of course the remaining 51% has to be corn. But generally, when the portion of the rye for the remaining percentages gets into the 20s or the 30s, it's considered a high rye bourbon. And the one I have on screen here from Redemption is actually 36% rye. It's manufactured by MGP in Indiana. It's one of their mash bills. And that is definitely considered a high rye bourbon, and they even write it on their label, as you can see here. All right, and then the final two sort of expressions I think you should know about. You may have heard about a wheated bourbon, also sometimes referred to as a wheater. So this is interesting. I think I told in the first lesson that if you make a bourbon, for instance, you typically put in corn, of course, and then rye as the second grain, and then some malted barley to get sort of the production going, which I'll cover. Sometimes the manufacturers exchange the rye for wheat. So if you take out the rye and put in the wheat in a bourbon, then you have a wheated bourbon. So it's not a wheat whiskey. So it's very confusing this. It's just a wheated bourbon with wheat in it instead of rye. And if you do that, I mean, it's really up to personal preference, but they tend to get a little bit sweeter. And you can see one here on the screen, Weller, which is very, very difficult to get hold of, at least some of them. And that's sort of, people really, really like this almost sourdough bread type of nose, and also a little bit on the taste that you get from a wheated bourbon. And then the final one here, you may have heard about a 4-grain whiskey. 4-grain, you may have guessed it. It doesn't have to be a 4-grain bourbon, it's just 4-grain. It just means that the manufacturer have decided to use 4 different grains. And in this example here, it will be corn, it will be rye, it will be wheat, and it will be barley. But in principle, it can be all types of different grains or corns. And on the topic of grain, by the way, so my next lesson, which will be a little bit of a nerd lesson, I'll go into excruciating details about what kind of grains you can use for making whiskey. All right, so that was lesson number 2, the different types of whiskeys in the United States, or at least my take on it. Thank you for watching and listening.